My name is David Moore, and for most of my life, I believed that being in charge meant being right. I ran a small construction company in a quiet town outside Oregon, the kind where everyone knows who you are and what you do. For years, I thought I understood people. I thought loyalty came from a paycheck and respect came from position. But I was wrong. Looking back now, I realize the mistake that changed everything didn't happen overnight. It started with a single decision. The day I fired a man named Ethan Clark. Ethan was one of my best workers. Quiet, honest, and hardworking. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his words carried weight. He'd been with my company for almost 5 years, never late, never caused trouble. He was the kind of man you could trust to finish what he started. But back then, I didn't value that. I valued people who agreed with me, who nodded, smiled, and did what they were told. Ethan wasn't one of them. It was around spring of 2003 when everything began to fall apart. Business was slow. Clients were cutting costs, deadlines were tight, and I was under pressure from investors. One morning, I got a call from a big client, a city contract for housing renovation. It was worth more than anything we'd handled before. If we pulled it off, my company's name would grow statewide. That kind of deal can make a man blind. I wanted it so badly that I started pushing everyone harder. Overtime, weekends, skipped safety checks. I told myself it was temporary, just to meet the deadline. Ethan was the only one who spoke up. He said, "Sir, the foundation mix isn't right. If we keep rushing, the structure won't hold." I remember the look in his eyes when he said that. Calm, not defiant, just honest. But to me at that time, it sounded like defiance. I thought he was trying to make me look weak in front of others. I snapped back, "You do your job, Ethan. I'll handle the rest." He didn't argue. He just nodded quietly and went back to work. But a few days later, I found out he had filed a safety report with the city inspector. That was the last straw for me. In my mind, he had betrayed the company, my company. I called him into the office that Friday, my temper already boiling. He stood in front of my desk, calm as ever. I didn't even let him speak. I said, "You think you can go behind my back and still work here?" He looked at me with tired eyes and said softly, "I didn't go behind your back, David. I did what was right." Those words hit me harder than I'd admit. But my pride wouldn't let me see sense. I told him to pack up and leave immediately. No warning. No severance. Nothing. He didn't plead. He didn't shout. He just took a deep breath and said, "One day you'll understand. I hope it won't be too late." Then he left, quietly, with the same dignity he'd always had. At the time, I felt powerful. I told myself I had done what a boss should do, protect his company from people who challenged him. But what I didn't realize was that I had just fired the one man who truly cared about the work we did. The weeks that followed were strange. We met the deadline, got the contract approved, and even received a small local award for the project. Everyone congratulated me. But deep down, something didn't feel right. 2 months later, the cracks began to appear, literally. The foundation Ethan had warned about started showing problems. Small fractures along the walls, uneven flooring, moisture leakage. We had to spend thousands fixing what we could, and I quietly made sure no one reported it to the city. Still, my pride wouldn't let me admit that Ethan had been right. Instead, I convinced myself that he was just lucky, that any experienced worker could have guessed the problem. Time went on, but things slowly started to decline. We lost clients, a few workers left, and I blamed everyone but myself. Meanwhile, I heard rumors. Ethan had joined another company in town, a small firm started by a few honest contractors. People said he was doing well there. I told myself I didn't care. But every time someone mentioned his name, a strange discomfort would rise inside me. Something I couldn't quite name, guilt maybe. Or fear of being exposed. Years passed. My son Ryan grew up during all this chaos. He was 15 when I fired Ethan, but even then, he had seen enough to know I was proud, maybe too proud. Ryan never said it, but he admired people like Ethan, calm, disciplined, fair. I could see it in his eyes whenever we talked about work. I remember once at dinner he asked me, "Dad, do you ever feel bad about firing him?" I frowned. Why would I? He went against the company. Ryan shrugged. Sometimes doing what's right looks like going against someone. I didn't reply. I changed the topic and told him to focus on his studies. But that one sentence lingered with me for years. As time went on, business got tougher. New competitors, digital systems, smarter methods. I couldn't keep up. Eventually, I sold what was left of my company and retired. I told myself I was done with the stress, the deadlines, the politics. But truthfully, I was running away from something deeper, from the guilt of knowing I had fired the only truly honest man who ever worked for me. I thought I had buried that chapter for good. Until one day, about 15 years later, life came full circle in a way I never expected. Ryan came home from his new job, all smiles. He had just been hired as a project manager for a construction firm, small but growing fast. He spoke about the work, the integrity, the leadership. And then he said the name of his new boss. Ethan Clark. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, staring out at the quiet street. I thought about how time has its own sense of justice, silent, patient, and exact. The man I had fired for honesty now employed my son. And the strangest part was, I felt peaceful. As if life had just shown me a mirror, and I finally saw who I truly was back then. When I look back now, I realize that pride doesn't always look like arrogance. Sometimes, it wears the mask of confidence, discipline, and success. Back then, people admired me. They said I had built something out of nothing. But they never saw what it cost me. I started more construction in my late 20s. Fresh out of a job that barely paid the bills, I borrowed money from my brother-in-law and bought a second-hand pickup truck, a few tools, and an old storage shed that became my office. It wasn't much, but I was proud of it. In those early years, I worked from sunrise till long after dark. Linda, my wife, used to bring me sandwiches in the evening, sometimes with Ryan sitting in the back seat, waving at me from the window. I wanted to give them a better life, a bigger home, better clothes, a name that people respected. Slowly, I did. Clients started trusting me, word spread, and by my 40s, I had nearly 30 men working under me. I had a good reputation, David Moore, the man who gets things done. But success has a strange way of twisting a man's sense of worth. When you start from nothing, every small victory feels like proof that you're smarter than everyone who doubted you. And soon, you start believing that your way is the only way. That's what happened to me. My crew respected me, but they also feared me. I was strict, maybe too strict. I believed that if a man wasn't tough enough to handle pressure, he didn't belong in my company. There was no room for hesitation or mistakes. If someone broke a tool, I made them pay for it. If someone was late, even once, I'd dock their pay. And if someone questioned my decisions, I'd make sure they knew who was in charge. I told myself it was discipline, but it was really control. The kind of control that makes you feel powerful because deep down, you're terrified of losing it. Linda often told me to slow down. She had a soft heart. She believed in people more than I did. Once she said, "David, you push people so hard you don't give them room to grow." I remember laughing it off. That's how business works, honey. You don't grow by being soft. She didn't argue. She rarely did. But I saw the worry in her eyes, the kind that comes from loving someone who's too proud to listen. That's when Ethan joined us. He came in through a referral, a quiet man in his 30s, tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes that seemed to hold something steady and calm. He didn't talk much during the interview. When I asked him why he wanted to work with us, he said simply, "I just want to build something that lasts." At the time, I thought it was a nice line, maybe even rehearsed. But later, I realized he meant it. Every word. From the first month, I could tell he was different. He didn't cut corners, didn't gossip, didn't rush. When others argued about who should do what, Ethan just did it. And when something went wrong, he didn't point fingers, he fixed it quietly. One evening, after everyone left, I saw him inspecting the site alone. I asked, "Don't you ever go home on time?" He smiled faintly and said, "I just like to make sure it's safe before we leave. My dad used to say, if it's worth doing, it's worth doing right." That line stuck with me. But back then, I didn't appreciate what it meant. Over the next few years, Ethan became the backbone of my company. Whenever there was a tough job, I assigned him. He didn't complain, even when I knew I was pushing too much. Clients loved him, said he was respectful and trustworthy. But that's also when my insecurities started to grow. I began noticing how some clients would ask for him by name. They'd say, "Can you send Ethan next week? He really understands the work." It shouldn't have bothered me, but it did. I felt like I was losing control, like someone else was slowly taking the light I believed belonged to me. Instead of appreciating him, I started finding faults. I'd criticize small things, a measurement off by an inch, a delay in delivery, a conversation I thought sounded too confident. Ethan never argued. He'd just nod and say, "Understood." That calmness infuriated me more than any backtalk could have. Because it reminded me that I wasn't really in control. At home, things weren't much better. Linda and I had grown distant, not angry, just silent. She was tired of watching me bring work home every night. And Ryan, who had just started high school, barely spoke to me except at dinner. He admired Ethan. Once, he saw Ethan at a community event and told me, "Dad, he's so kind. He helped Mrs. Peterson fix her porch for free." I brushed it off, pretending I didn't care. But deep down it stung, my own son looking up to one of my workers. I wanted Ryan to see me as the example of strength, not Ethan. So I worked harder, shouted louder, and demanded more from everyone, as if proving my authority could fix the respect I felt slipping away. The pressure peaked when we got that big city project, the housing development contract I mentioned earlier. It was our biggest opportunity, but also our biggest test. Delays could kill us financially. I remember the meeting before we started. I told everyone, "This is it. No mistakes. No excuses. We finish this ahead of schedule, and every one of you gets a bonus." Ethan raised his hand, quietly. "Sir, the schedule seems too tight. Maybe we should add a few more days for curing the concrete. Otherwise, it might cause long-term issues." I looked at him, the only one in the room questioning my plan. I could feel every eye watching me. I said sharply, "We don't need more days, Ethan. We need results." He nodded and didn't speak again. But I could see it in his face. Disappointment, not defiance. Over the next few weeks, the project moved fast, too fast. We met targets, but safety checks got ignored. Suppliers were rushing, workers were exhausted. And through all of it, Ethan quietly tried to keep things right. He reminded the team about proper ratios, material strength, curing time. He even came to me twice to discuss it again. But I brushed him off both times. Until that day when the inspector showed up unannounced. I still remember the panic in my chest when the man in the yellow helmet walked onto the site with a clipboard. He wasn't supposed to come until next week. And when I found out Ethan had filed a report, not for sabotage, but for safety, my pride exploded. I didn't see it as honesty. I saw it as betrayal. I can still hear his calm voice from that afternoon in my office. "I did what was right, David." And I can still hear my own voice, loud, angry, certain. "You're fired." That night, Linda didn't speak to me. She had overheard the news from one of the workers' wives. At dinner, she just said softly, "You made a mistake." I said, "I did what had to be done." She looked at me for a long time, then said, Maybe one day you'll understand the difference.
I didn't, not then. But she was right.
The company started falling apart not long after that, slowly, like a wall losing its base. I lost good people, one after another. The same quiet loyalty Ethan once gave me disappeared from the rest of them too. You can't demand honesty when you punish it. You can't expect loyalty when you replace trust with fear. I learned that lesson too late. By the time I turned 60, I had sold the company. The office was gone, the trucks were gone, and all I had left were the stories people whispered, about how I once fired the best man I ever had. Ryan had grown into a fine man, independent, kind, and smarter than I ever was at his age. He went to college, studied management, and told me he wanted to work for a company that values people. I didn't realize it then, but he was already walking toward the same man I had once pushed away. The day Ryan told me who his new boss was, I froze mid-sentence. He was sitting across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where Linda and I had shared countless quiet dinners and a few silent arguments. I was stirring my coffee when he said it, casually, like any son sharing good news. "Dad," he said, "you won't believe this. My new boss, he's incredible. His name's Ethan Clark." I remember my hand tightening around the spoon. The metal clinked against the cup, a sound louder than it should have been. For a moment, I thought I misheard him. "Who?" I asked, my voice too calm to be natural. "Ethan Clark," he repeated. "You might not know him, but he runs a small construction firm, Clark Developments. They've got a great reputation around town. They're expanding fast, and he's very hands-on with the team. He's fair, professional, and I don't know, there's something about him. He's one of those people you can't help but respect." I stared at him. My own son, admiring the man I once threw out of my office like trash. I forced a smile and said, "Sounds like you've found a good place." Inside, though, I felt a storm building. That night, after Ryan went to bed, I sat alone in the living room. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. I looked at the old photograph on the shelf, me, Linda, and Ryan, taken years ago at the opening of my first company office. My eyes drifted to my own face, the confident smile, the proud stance, and I barely recognized that man. Ethan Clark. Even after all these years, just his name brought a weight I couldn't shake. Over the next few weeks, Ryan spoke about him constantly. "Dad, he doesn't shout at anyone, he listens. He treats every worker like they matter. He remembers people's birthdays, even the guys who sweep the floors." Each sentence was a tiny needle, pricking what was left of my pride. But more than that, it was a mirror, reflecting everything I failed to be. I wanted to feel happy for my son, I truly did. But every time I heard Ethan's name, guilt wrapped tighter around my chest. I began to realize how deeply that one act, that one moment of arrogance, had shaped both our lives. I wondered if Ethan recognized Ryan's last name. Did he know that the young man working under him was the son of the man who once humiliated him? Did he treat Ryan kindly out of professionalism, or was this some quiet revenge I couldn't see coming? The thought haunted me. One evening, about 3 months into Ryan's new job, he came home with a small smile. He placed a folder on the table. "Dad, we're handling a big renovation downtown, the City Museum. It's Ethan's personal project. He's leading the design himself. You should see how he works, it's incredible." He opened the folder, showing blueprints and site photos. And there it was, Ethan's signature at the bottom of every document. Precise. Confident. Familiar. I stared at it for a long time, my mind going back to the days when I used to sign off blueprints with the same certainty. Back when my name meant something. "Dad?" Ryan asked. I blinked. He smiled. "I was thinking, maybe you could come by the site sometime. Meet him. I told him a lot about you." My stomach twisted. You told him about me?" "Of course," Ryan said, grinning. "He even said he remembered a David Moore from years ago. He said you were one of the best project leaders he ever met.
I couldn't speak for a moment.
He remembered me. And instead of bitterness, he spoke well of me. That small act of grace hurt more than anger ever could. I didn't go to the site that week.
Or the week after.
But I thought about it every day. Linda used to say that life has a strange sense of humor. It doesn't shout lessons at you, it whispers them through irony. And here I was, living proof of it. The man I'd wronged the most was now shaping my son's future, not through revenge, but through decency. And that somehow made my own mistakes feel heavier. One Saturday afternoon, Ryan came home early. "Dad," he said, "Ethan invited me and a few others to a small dinner at his place tonight. It's just a team get-together. He told me to bring you if you'd like. Said he'd love to see you again." My first instinct was to refuse. The idea of sitting across from him, the man I fired without remorse, terrified me. What would I even say? "Sorry I ruined your career? Thank you for not ruining mine in return?" But Ryan looked so hopeful. And part of me, the part that had carried guilt for nearly 20 years, wanted closure. So, I agreed. That evening, I wore my best shirt, not out of pride but respect. When we arrived, Ethan's home surprised me. It wasn't grand or flashy, it was simple, warm, and welcoming. Lights glowed softly through the windows. A few of his colleagues were already there, laughing near the porch.
And then I saw him. Ethan Clark.
Older now, gray touching his hair, lines on his face deeper but kind. He turned when Ryan called out, and his eyes met mine.
For a moment, time stopped.
There was no tension, no awkwardness, just quiet recognition. He walked toward me with a calm smile. "David," he said, extending his hand. I hesitated, then took it. His grip was firm, steady, the same as I remembered. "It's been a long time," he said softly. "Yes," I replied, my voice rough. "It has." He nodded once, his eyes holding no anger, only calm understanding. That unnerved me more than anything. Throughout the evening, he treated me like a guest, not an enemy. He asked about my health, about retirement, about Linda. He even complimented Ryan, said he was hardworking, honest, and capable. Every word felt like grace I didn't deserve. When the guests began to leave, I found myself standing alone with him on the porch. The night air was cool, carrying the faint smell of pine and rain. Ethan leaned on the railing and said quietly, "Ryan's a good man, David. You raised him well." I shook my head slowly. No, he raised himself better than I ever could. Ethan smiled faintly. "You're too hard on yourself." I hesitated, then finally asked, "You knew all along, didn't you? That he was my son?"
He nodded. "Yes."
The first day he mentioned his name. I looked down, shame burning in my chest. "And you still hired him?" "I didn't hire him because of you," he said. "I hired him because he deserved it." He reminded me of who I used to be. That line cut deep, not in cruelty but truth. I whispered, "Ethan, I wronged you. I fired you when you were only trying to do the right thing. I've thought about it for years." He looked at me, calm, almost sad. "I know. But you don't have to carry it anymore." That day taught me something too. Sometimes, the only way to build something strong is to let the old foundation break first. I didn't know what to say. There was no anger in him, no bitterness. Just quiet wisdom, the kind that comes from pain healed, not forgotten. After that night, I couldn't stop thinking about what he said. Let the old foundation break first. It stayed with me for weeks. Maybe because my entire life had been built on a foundation of pride, and it finally cracked. I began visiting Ryan's workplace occasionally. Not to interfere, but to observe, to see how Ethan led his people. And every time, I saw something that humbled me. He listened to everyone, from the youngest intern to the oldest technician. He walked the sites himself, talked to workers by name, thanked them personally.
When a mistake happened, he didn't shout.
He'd say, "We learn, and we move forward." I realized then, that's what true leadership looks like.
Not power. Not fear. Respect.
I used to think respect was something you demanded. But Ethan showed me it's something you earn. Quietly, by doing what's right even when no one's watching. One day, while Ryan and I were having lunch, he said something that made me smile in a way I hadn't in years. "Dad," he said, "Ethan told me he used to work for a man who fired him unfairly a long time ago. He said that man taught him his most important lesson."
I felt my chest tighten.
"What lesson was that?"
Ryan smiled.
"That sometimes people hurt others because they're scared. But the smart ones learn from it, and forgive." For the first time in a long while, I couldn't speak. My throat closed up, and I just nodded slowly. That night, I sat by the window again, the same place I had sat years ago when I first realized what I'd done wrong. But this time, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt cleansing. Over the next few months, Ethan and I crossed paths more often, at events, gatherings, and sometimes just by chance.
Each time, there was quiet respect between us.
No awkwardness, no guilt, just two men who had walked through different storms and come out wiser. And yet, deep down, I knew life wasn't done teaching me. Because the true test of humility isn't in apologizing, it's in learning to live differently afterward. There's a saying that time humbles everyone, no matter how high they stand. I never believed that until I found myself staring at my own reflection one evening, realizing the man in the mirror wasn't proud of who he had become. Years had gone by since I'd fired Ethan. The company I once built with passion had turned into a machine of profit. My board members spoke more about numbers than people. My decisions were no longer guided by values but by convenience.
And the strange part? I knew it.
I knew I had changed, but I told myself it was necessary, that business demanded it. But something inside me never felt right. One night, I was sitting in my office, the building empty except for the hum of the air conditioning. I glanced through old project files. There, in a folder marked Staff, 2012, I found Ethan's name. His termination letter was attached, my own signature at the bottom. For a moment, I couldn't look away from that paper. My words were cold, impersonal. Lack of team alignment. Integrity concerns. I'd written that because he had told me the truth I didn't want to hear. I leaned back in my chair and sighed. "Integrity concerns," I whispered. "I fired a man for being honest." The irony burned deeper with each passing day. A few months later, my son Daniel graduated from business school. He was bright, ambitious, and full of excitement about joining the corporate world. I had plans for him. I wanted him to work under me, learn the ropes, and eventually take over the business. But Daniel had other ideas. "Dad," he said one evening over dinner, "I've been offered a position at a mid-sized firm downtown. They specialize in sustainable materials. The CEO seems real. Grounded. I want to start there. Learn something different before coming into your world." I didn't like the sound of it. I wanted him close, under my guidance, not learning from strangers who didn't understand our way of doing business. "Daniel," I said, setting down my fork, "you don't need to waste time there. You have opportunities most people would kill for. Why start from the bottom?" He smiled, calm and respectful. "Because, Dad, I want to earn what I become. Not inherit it." There was a hint of quiet determination in his voice that reminded me of someone. Someone I once knew. Ethan. Still, I let him go. I told myself it was just a phase. He'd come around after a year or two. Months passed. Daniel rarely talked about his new workplace, but when he did, there was admiration in his tone. "He's different, Dad," he said one night, referring to his boss. "He listens to everyone. Even the interns. He believes people matter more than profit. You'd like him." I smiled faintly. "Sounds idealistic." "Maybe," Daniel said, "but he makes it work. He built the company from scratch, Started with nothing.
People trust him.
That name, that description, it started stirring something in my mind.
What's his name?
I asked casually.
Ethan Reed.
The world seemed to freeze around me. My fork slipped from my hand and clattered onto the plate.
Daniel looked up, surprised. Dad? You okay?
I nodded slowly. Yeah, just that name. Sounds familiar. But I already knew it wasn't just familiar.
It was haunting.
That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the name echoing through my mind like a forgotten song.
Ethan Reed.
The man I had wronged so easily, the man whose honesty I had crushed because it made me uncomfortable. And now my son worked for him. It was almost poetic, too precise to be coincidence. The next morning, I drove downtown. I told myself it was just curiosity. I wanted to see the place my son admired so much. The building wasn't large or glamorous. No shiny glass towers, no marble floors. Just a clean, modern space with a simple sign, Reed Innovations. I parked across the street and sat there for a few minutes, watching employees enter with smiles and coffee cups. There was something peaceful about the place.
And then I saw him. Ethan.
He was stepping out of a black SUV, wearing a gray suit, simple, not extravagant. His hair was grayer now, but his posture was confident, steady. He greeted every employee who passed by, with warmth, not authority. I felt a strange mix of pride and shame watching him. Pride, because he'd clearly built something good. Shame, because I'd once been blind to his worth. I thought about going in, about walking up to him, shaking his hand, maybe even apologizing.
But I couldn't.
I wasn't ready. My pride still had chains around me. So, I drove away. Over the next few months, Daniel continued to work there. His tone grew more grounded, his outlook more mature. He talked about empathy, teamwork, and purpose, words I used to consider weak in business. I realized that my son was learning everything I had forgotten. Then one day, he came home looking uneasy. "What's wrong?" I asked.
He hesitated.
"We had a meeting today." Ethan told us a story about his past. About how he got fired unfairly years ago, by a company that accused him of dishonesty when all he did was tell the truth. I felt a tightness in my chest. He said, Daniel continued softly, that it was the best thing that ever happened to him. Because it taught him what kind of leader he'd never want to be. I swallowed hard, keeping my face steady. Did he mention the company?
No. He didn't name anyone.
Just said it was a lesson he'd carried forever. Daniel leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. You know, Dad, I think that kind of grace is rare. Most people would have held on to bitterness. I nodded slowly. Yes. Very rare. Inside, my mind was spinning. Ethan hadn't just survived, he had transformed pain into wisdom. And while I'd built wealth, he'd built something far greater, respect. A few weeks later, Daniel invited me to an awards ceremony his company was hosting. Ethan's receiving an Entrepreneur of the Year award, he said proudly.
You should come. You'll like him. I hesitated.
Every part of me wanted to refuse, to avoid facing the ghost of my own past. But some part of me, maybe the better part, whispered go.
Face it.
The night of the ceremony, I wore my best suit, but my heart felt heavy. The event was held in a modest but elegant hall. People greeted each other warmly, not formally. It felt less like a business event and more like a family gathering. When Ethan walked on stage to accept his award, the room erupted in applause. He took the microphone and smiled. I've been blessed with many lessons in life, he began.
Some painful, some humbling.
Years ago, I was fired from a job I loved. It hurt deeply, but looking back, it was the moment that freed me. It forced me to build something honest, something that reflects the values I once got punished for. His eyes scanned the room, calm and kind. If anyone here has ever been treated unfairly, I want you to remember, Sometimes, rejection is just redirection. The crowd cheered. I sat quietly, my eyes stinging. When the event ended, Daniel led me toward him. "Dad, I want you to meet my boss." Every step I took felt like walking through years of regret. "Ethan," Daniel said with a bright smile, "this is my father, Michael Turner."
Ethan turned to me. For a moment, his expression froze.
Recognition flickered in his eyes. Not anger, just quiet understanding. "Michael," he said slowly, offering his hand. "It's been a long time." I took it, my grip unsteady. "It has," I replied softly.
"Too long."
He smiled politely. "I see life has come full circle."
I nodded, my throat tight.
"It certainly has." We stood there for a moment, two men bound by an old wound that had somehow healed itself through time and grace. He could have humiliated me, could have reminded me of my mistake in front of everyone. But instead he said, "Daniel's one of the most promising young men I've met. You raised him well." That single sentence broke me more than any confrontation could. That night, as I drove home, I couldn't stop thinking about the quiet power Ethan had displayed. He didn't need revenge. He had already won through his integrity. And the irony, the beautiful irony, was that my own son now worked under him, learning the lessons I had ignored. In that moment, I realized something profound. Revenge doesn't always come with anger. Sometimes, it arrives as humility, a silent mirror showing you the truth of who you once were. That night after the ceremony, I couldn't sleep. My mind was a storm of memories and realizations, flashes of the past mixing with the calm face of the man I had wronged. I had always thought power and wealth gave me control over life, but now, for the first time, I saw how small I'd been. Ethan had lost everything I took from him and still managed to build something far more meaningful than I ever had. As I sat alone in my study, I stared at the wall of framed achievements, awards, certificates, newspaper features. They once made me proud, but now they felt hollow. Not one of them reflected kindness or decency. They spoke only of success, not value. I realized how far I'd drifted from the man I once wanted to be. The next morning, I went into the office, but my heart wasn't in it. My staff's polite smiles felt forced. Conversations about profits and projections sounded empty. For the first time, I noticed how fear guided every interaction in that building. Fear of failure, fear of me. That wasn't leadership. That was control. I spent the whole day replaying Ethan's calm smile when he said, "You raised him well."
It wasn't sarcasm.
It was genuine grace, the kind that comes only from peace. He could have shamed me, could have exposed my mistake publicly, but he chose forgiveness through silence. That kind of strength humbled me. By evening, I made a decision that surprised even me. I called Daniel. "Can we talk tonight?" "Of course," he said, a little concerned. "Everything okay?" "I think it's time you knew a few things about your father," I replied quietly. That night, Daniel came home. We sat across from each other at the dining table, the same one where years ago, I'd told him to work under me instead of chasing his own path. I took a deep breath. "Daniel," I began, "there's something I need to tell you about your boss, about Ethan Reed." He frowned slightly. "What about him?" "I know him." In fact, I paused, struggling to find the words. "I was the one who fired him years ago." Daniel stared at me, disbelief flashing in his eyes. "You?" "Yes," I said, my voice low. "He worked for me when I ran Turner Manufacturing. He was honest, too honest perhaps. He pointed out a flaw in our supply ethics, and instead of listening, I punished him. I was proud, stubborn, and insecure. I fired him because his integrity made me uncomfortable." Daniel leaned back, speechless. I continued, "When I saw him at the award ceremony, I realized he'd achieved everything I once had, but with grace, not ambition. I destroyed a good man's career, and yet, he stood in front of me years later without an ounce of bitterness. That's something I'll never forget." There was silence between us. Daniel's face softened after a while. "Dad," he said gently, "he never spoke ill of you."
Never.
"I think he made peace with it long ago."
I nodded, eyes moist. I know.
"And that's what makes me admire him even more." Daniel reached across the table and placed his hand on mine. "Then maybe it's time you make peace too." His words sank deep. Maybe it was time indeed. The following week, I drove to Ethan's office. No business reason, no invitation, just a man seeking closure. I asked the receptionist if he was available. She smiled and told me to wait. A few minutes later he stepped out, surprised but composed. "Michael," he said calmly. "This is unexpected." "I won't take much of your time," I said. "I just need to talk." He nodded and led me into his office. It was modest, wooden shelves lined with books, family photos, and a few awards. Nothing extravagant, but everything in that room felt real, earned, and grounded. I took a seat, feeling the weight of my own guilt. "Ethan," I began, "I came to say something I should have said years ago.
I was wrong.
I treated you unfairly, and I fired you for doing the right thing. I was blinded by pride. I wanted control, not truth." He listened quietly, his expression patient, his eyes steady. "I've carried that mistake for years," I continued. "Seeing what you've built, the kind of leader you are, I realized you became everything I failed to be." There was a long pause before he spoke. "Michael, life has a way of humbling us all," he said gently. "What happened back then, it hurt, yes. But it also shaped me. It taught me to build differently, to value people over power. If it hadn't happened, I might not be where I am." I looked at him, stunned by his calmness. "You're not angry?" I asked quietly. He smiled faintly. "Anger doesn't serve much purpose after peace has been found. I forgave you a long time ago." Those words broke something open inside me, a knot of regret that had sat buried for years. I nodded slowly, unable to speak. Finally I said, "Thank you, Ethan.
For your grace.
And for teaching me a lesson I should have learned long ago."
He reached out his hand. "We all have our paths, Michael.
What matters is how we walk them from here on." We shook hands, not as rivals, but as men who understood each other's humanity. After that day, I began to change the way I lived. I didn't make any grand declarations. I didn't resign from my position or announce a transformation. I just began doing small things differently. I started listening, truly listening, to my employees. I held meetings where people could speak freely without fear. I rewarded honesty, not just results.
At first, people were surprised.
Some didn't trust the change. But over time, they began to see that I meant it. And the funny thing was, the business actually improved. Morale rose, innovation flourished, and for the first time in years, my office felt alive. I also began mentoring young professionals outside my company, especially those who'd been overlooked or treated unfairly. I told them my story, not to gain sympathy, but to remind them that power means nothing without integrity. Every time I spoke those words, I thought of Ethan. A few months later, Daniel came to me with an unexpected proposal. "Dad," he said, "Ethan and I have been discussing a joint project. A collaboration between his company and yours, sustainable materials for industrial use. He wants you on board as a partner."
I stared at him.
"He wants to work with me?"
Daniel smiled. "Yes."
He said he believes in redemption, and in second chances. I couldn't help but laugh softly, shaking my head. That man, he has a heart made of steel and kindness.
Daniel grinned.
He said something else too, that you have more to give than you realize. I didn't know what to say. All I could feel was gratitude, not just for Ethan's forgiveness, but for life's quiet way of balancing things. When the partnership began, I visited Ethan's company frequently. Our interactions were polite, professional, but beneath that was mutual respect. He never mentioned the past again.
He didn't need to.
His calm presence reminded me daily of the lesson I'd learned. One evening, after a long meeting, we stood by the window watching the sunset reflect off the glass buildings. Ethan said, "You know, Michael, life isn't always about revenge or redemption. Sometimes it's just about realization."
I nodded slowly. And peace. He smiled.
Exactly. Peace, the one thing most people forget to chase. For a moment, we stood in silence, two men who had once been enemies, now sharing a quiet moment of understanding. I realized then that true revenge isn't about making someone suffer. It's about growing beyond the need to.
Months passed.
Our joint project succeeded beyond expectations. It wasn't just profitable, it was meaningful. Workers from both companies collaborated like one family. One day, during a team lunch, Ethan stood up to make a short speech. "I want to thank everyone for proving that integrity and business can coexist," he said. "This partnership reminded me that people can change, and that forgiveness can turn mistakes into foundations for something better." He glanced at me briefly, and I nodded with quiet respect. No one else in the room understood the history between us, and they didn't need to. That moment wasn't about the past. It was about growth. Later that evening, as I drove home, I reflected on everything. The irony of life, the softness of karma, the beauty of time. Years ago, I had destroyed a man's career because I thought power meant dominance. Today, that same man taught me that real power is the ability to forgive. And perhaps that was the greatest form of justice, not to see someone fall, but to witness them rise higher than ever, and still offer you a hand when you stumble. I pulled into my driveway and sat in silence, the sun setting behind the trees. I thought of my son, how he admired Ethan, how he learned values I once ignored. I felt grateful that Daniel had met a man who could teach him through example what I had failed to show through authority. I whispered to myself, "I fired an honest man once. Now my son works for him, and maybe that's life's way of showing me what honesty truly builds." I smiled then, a quiet, content smile. Because for the first time in many years, I felt free. Years passed, and with them, the sharp edges of my old self softened. The empire I once ruled through authority became a legacy built on empathy. And strangely, the man who taught me that lesson was the same one I had once wronged. Life has a way of bringing us full circle, not through grand revenge or punishment, but through gentle correction. It never shouted at me. It whispered. Through Ethan. Through my son. Through time itself. One quiet Sunday morning, I found myself walking through the park near my house. The trees were just beginning to turn golden with autumn, and families were out enjoying the crisp air. I sat down on a bench, watching children play with kites while their parents laughed nearby. For years, I'd missed moments like this, too busy chasing numbers, too proud to pause. But now, peace wasn't something I waited for. It was something I carried within me. As I sat there, I thought about the strange, poetic balance of life. How I'd once fired an honest man for his truth, and how that truth, years later, had quietly rebuilt me. How my own son, raised under the shadow of my mistakes, found light under the guidance of that same man. It wasn't coincidence. It was correction. When Daniel joined me on that bench later, holding 2 cups of coffee, I smiled at him. He'd grown into the kind of man I once pretended to be, calm, grounded, fair. "Ethan called," he said, handing me a cup. "He's retiring soon. Wants to hand over more responsibility to me." I looked at him, pride swelling in my chest. "You've earned it," I said. He smiled. He said something interesting today. He said, "You can't undo the past, but you can outgrow it." I chuckled softly. That sounds like him. Daniel looked at me thoughtfully. "Do you ever think about the past, Dad?" "Every day," I said honestly. "But not with regret anymore. With understanding." He nodded slowly, then said, "Ethan told me once that forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of anger." I looked at my son, realizing he was quoting the very man I'd once broken, and yet, Ethan had passed on lessons through him that had healed us both. A few weeks later, Ethan invited me to his retirement dinner, a small gathering with close colleagues and friends. I went, not as a guest of formality, but as someone who wanted to honor the quiet strength of a good man. When it was time for speeches, Ethan stood at the front of the room. "I started this company with one simple rule," he said. "Always choose honesty, even when it costs you." People nodded, smiling, inspired. He looked toward me then, his eyes calm and kind. "Many years ago, I learned that doing the right thing doesn't always reward you immediately. Sometimes it takes years, even decades, for the truth to come back full circle. But when it does, it brings peace." Our eyes met. No one else in that room understood what passed between us in that moment, but it was enough. That silent acknowledgement was closure. No bitterness. No need for apology anymore. Just two men who had both grown, both learned, both found peace in their own ways. After the dinner, as I was leaving, Ethan walked beside me to the door. "I'm glad you came," he said softly. "I wouldn't have missed it," I replied. He smiled. "You know, Michael, what happened years ago, it was painful, yes. But it also pushed me to build something that mattered. So, in a way, I owe you." I shook my head. "No, Ethan. If anything, I owe you. You taught me the kind of man I should have been all along." He paused, his eyes reflecting the wisdom of someone who had long made peace with the world. "Then maybe," he said, "we both got what we needed from it." We shook hands one final time, firm, respectful, at peace. No resentment, no guilt. Just gratitude. As I walked to my car, I realized something profound. Revenge had never been part of his journey. He never tried to make me suffer, never sought to get even. His revenge, if you could call it that, was his success, his grace, his peace, and the man I had become because of it. Years later, when I finally stepped down from my own position, I handed over the company to Daniel. But before I did, I called the team together for one last meeting. I told them a story, not with names, not with details, but with truth. I told them how once, long ago, I fired a man for being honest. How that decision haunted me, changed me, and eventually saved me. I told them that every mistake has two outcomes, destruction or growth, and that the choice between the two depends on humility. When I finished, the room was silent. Then someone asked, "What happened to the man you fired?" I smiled. "He became everything I should have been. And I became better because of him." It wasn't a dramatic ending. It wasn't meant to be. It was simply the truth. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I still think about that day when I saw Ethan step onto the stage to receive his award. The pride in his eyes, the calm in his voice, the grace in his forgiveness. That moment became a turning point in my life. It taught me that revenge doesn't have to roar. Sometimes it whispers, through forgiveness, through dignity, through time. Because what truly humbles a person isn't punishment. It's watching the one you wronged rise above the need for it. And that, I've learned, is the most powerful kind of justice. Now, in my older years, I spend my mornings in the garden behind my house. I drink my coffee slowly. I listen to the wind move through the trees. There's no noise, no chaos, no deadlines. Just peace. Sometimes Daniel visits, and we talk about leadership, family, and the strange ways life teaches us lessons we never asked for. He often quotes Ethan, words filled with quiet wisdom. And every time he does, I smile, because I know the world is a little better for men like Ethan Reed. I often think about how, if I could go back, I'd do things differently. But maybe that's the point. We don't get to redo the past. We get to understand it. We get to grow from it. We get to make sure that the people who come after us, our children, our teams, our friends, don't repeat it. As the sun sets over my garden, I find myself whispering the same sentence every time. Sometimes silence is the best revenge. Because silence doesn't mean weakness. It means strength, the kind that comes from knowing the truth, yet choosing peace.